86. And they were all written by James Madison. We're getting now into the more specifics about how the Constitution worked. A lot of the first half, or more than the first half, is really just arguing we do need a Constitution. We shouldn't have a weak federal government that's overwhelmed and ignored and unable to organize the states. So we need to have this kind of government here, and we need to have a government governed by this kind of general constitution or the general idea that the Constitution has been set up and defending the convention. Now we're getting into how it will work, and with transition of that is kind of with papers 50 and 51, and getting into now the House of Representatives. So we're finishing up sort of the defense of the convention and the necessity for the federal government under this particular constitution, and now getting into the representation. So I'd say just the thing that stands out to me most was of any of these things. We can start off with this, and we'll have a lot of other things to talk about too. But was Madison's very vivid picture of if the federal government gets out of hand, don't worry, the states and all their militias will be called out, and the armed people of the United States will be resisting it. That was probably the most vivid picture anybody's painted in the whole Federalist Papers so far, and it was just very interesting to hear, to read him talking about that.
Yeah, it was, he goes through and he makes the usual argument that don't worry, this national government has many of the powers that we had under the Articles of Confederation. We're set up very similar to your state governments. Don't worry. And you know what? If we do cross that line, you can all rise up and overthrow us.
Yeah.
From
the British Empire.
Oh, yeah.
Federal government.
Yeah, it's just that, like, almost to me, came out of left field when he just was adamant that don't worry.
I mean, it's pretty.
People take that message quite seriously even now.
Well, I mean, in the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson says it's your right, it's your duty to overthrow a tyrannical government. And until I read these, I never knew that Madison carried that thought through. So I'm starting to think those people in northern Michigan aren't quite so crazy after all. Because they're certainly following what Madison is saying. And the people who, I know there's a lot of people opposed to the Second Amendment. Madison's pretty clear that people have to have their guns so they can do this. So this is one of the strongest, I think, arguments for those who say the Second Amendment only meant guns in a well-regulated militia. I think Madison's clear that people have to have their guns to keep the federal government in line. Now, for those of you at home, I would not suggest that today. I think the government would take too lightly to that.
For point of reference, that was Federalist Paper 46. Accurate.
Yeah, I just found it interesting, like the whole idea of him saying, it's okay if we get out of hand, you as the states can rise up and take us over. We're fine with that. But I also kind of saw it as that, like, if there was a political cartoonist at the time, reading these, he probably would have been tempted to draw one of Madison beating a dead horse that had states' rights and states' rights versus federal rights written on it, and then I'm sure at some point Madison was writing some of these that he was just beating his head against the wall, thinking, how many different ways do we have to explain that?
Yeah.
There are protections in place.
Yeah. The redundancy, started for me to wear a little thin until the part about both the girls. And then I thought, okay, Jim's getting mad, and he's getting riled up.
Yeah. When I was reading this, I also heard at certain parts the chorus line from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. On with that.
It's very deliberate, a very deliberate pace of these. A lot of it just spent on like saying you've got to have a strong central government. There's tons of papers on that with saying it doesn't work to have federations. It doesn't work to have these kind of confederations. You need something that's really got some kind of gravity here. It's not dependent on the states as a whole, or only dependent on them. It can be checked by them, but it can't be only dependent on the states. It's not a creature of them. It's a creature of the American people. And now, it took about 50 entries in this to get into the actual structure of the government.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because we take it like for granted
how they envision this new national federal government working. So in 47, that's where he begins with, what a lot of people find to be the hallmark of the American Constitution is, he calls them departments, but the separation of powers in the three branches of government.
I found 47 really interesting when I was reading because he does a good job of explaining the idea of separation of powers, but then also he challenges the critics to it who are saying that all three branches need to be totally separate and not have any influence over the other. And then he goes through and it's like, and he says to his critics that okay, you're basing this off of what Montesquieu said, but do you really understand what Montesquieu said? Here's what I think he said, and then here's how that applies to every single state constitution thus far, where they say, where basically all of the state constitutions said the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary need to be separate, but there was still that little bit where basically it wasn't, you couldn't have a job in two of the three at the same time, and to limit undue influence of one or two over the other, but there was no mention of the three of them being totally separate. And he basically says in, I think it's 48, that if you try and have three distinct and totally separate branches, you won't have a government, because it'll be three different bodies of people fighting over who's in charge and who has the power.
Yeah, and he said there's got to be some overlap to make it all work. And I think he points out that in their own way, each of these three branches are also going to be responsible to the people. That's the one theme that I found very, that kind of wove through many of these sets of papers, was the power of government comes from the people. And he says even though the people aren't directly choosing the president, they're not directly choosing federal judges, those people are still going to listen to public opinion and be affected by public opinion and be aware that the public is watching them. So that was, at the Constitutional Convention, their biggest argument was over should power of this from this new national government derive from people or from the states. And Madison was adamant that government's power has to come from the people.
And even the judiciary.
Well, he said in a roundabout way they should still to some degree be influenced by the people because it is the people's government.
And speaking of the government being beholden to the people, I found 48 really interesting just with how reticent Hamilton is of the fact that he basically talks about how, he calls them the parchment barriers settled into the Constitution aren't enough. Like, just the fact that he was able to recognize that people, regardless of their intentions, have the possibility of being corrupt and wanting to do things solely for their own ends, and the need to guard against that as best as possible. The fact that he was able to see that as a challenge to the government, really before the government was even set up, is, I think, amazingly brilliant.
Yeah, and in 48 he's got what I think is one of his better quotes in which, and he writes this in capital letters, an elective despotism was not the government we fought for, and he wants to point out that he doesn't, he's trying to alleviate people's fear of maybe like tyranny of democracy or tyranny of the majority, and he just simply keeps reminding the people that what they fought for was their liberties, was their freedoms, and the best way to do that is with this government.
Yeah, he talks about the hidden danger in a republic or a democracy, or a republic is the legislature. Everybody thinks that the legislature, that's who's going to be, but they could. The state governments seem to be so keen on limiting the executive and the judicial that the hidden danger was the legislature that could pass all sorts of laws, and so we've got to figure out how to limit that in some way.
Well, he kind of draws attention to it in here, saying that, hey, the legislature is the one that controls the money and pays the people in the other two, so they're kind of the ones you got to watch out for.
Yeah, because really, ultimately, the legislature does have all of the power in the new Constitution in that they can impeach the president, they can impeach federal judges. The Constitution says Congress is kind of over the courts, so they establish the courts and the court system. So, yeah, they do kind of have that lion's share of power. There's those checks and balances on it, but yeah, he was, right to warn people that, you do have to watch for that legislative tyranny.
Right. Yeah, and it's so different but it's definitely different where the presidency has become, at least since the 20th century and on. The presidency has become the centerpiece of the political system of people are most focused on. By the reason why they say there's Congress is the first article of the Constitution. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people like Washington's and the presidents, Washington and others kind of saw themselves in a pretty limited role.
Right.
I'm just going to enforce what Congress does. I won't veto anything unless it's unconstitutional. It's interesting how that presidency has evolved.
Yeah, I mean, they kind of, the early presidents kind of viewed themselves as chief executive officers. Congress set policy, and then it was their job to enforce that policy. But
where do you see the first extension of executive power?
Oh, I mean, you could possibly trace it back to Andrew Jackson, because he was the first president who felt it was his job to lead the country. He used the veto more times than the 6 or 7 presidents before him combined. Like Scott said, the first presidents only vetoed acts they thought were unconstitutional. He vetoed something and he didn't like it. So some suggest he was the first. I mean, Lincoln during the Civil War certainly, in essence, became a dictator. But I would probably say FDR is where it really took hold and has never really let go. Because after Lincoln was assassinated, Congress made this concerted effort to get its power back from the president. And the presidents that followed Lincoln were pretty weak presidents, and were presidents who were willing to defer to Congress to lead. They kind of saw themselves as, that in the mold of those first presidents, their job was just to run the government. So I would say most people kind of date the modern presidency to FDR.
Kind of tracks with American international power too.
Yeah.
Where you kind of need the arguments when you need that central figure to sort of run world relations and everything.
The one person who speaks for the whole country.
One wonders which one causes the other, whether stronger presidents lead to a greater expansion of international power for America, or it's just greater international prestige and influence that leads to a president stepping up into this more central role.
Yeah, it is. But, we pretty much during and after World War II, whether a president liked it or not, they were a world leader. Mm-hmm. He had just, especially when we, signed up for NATO, we basically committed ourselves to be an international police force for the world, and we're going to get involved.
Leader of the free world.
Right, exactly. And now the people look to the president. I mean, the people look to this election this summer is going to be whose fault is it that gas prices are too high? Right? If gas prices were low, you could be sure that Obama would be out there saying, see, I lowered those gas prices. Now that they're too high, he's going to be out there saying, what can I do about the gas prices? And of course, Republicans are going to be blaming it all on him.
Running all over the country. Oh, you elect me, I'll bring gas back to $2.50. But I retort, if you can drop it that much, why not take it back to $1 again?
Well, that's just crazy talk. Yeah, it's whatever problems are. It's always the fault of the most recent president of the opposing party.
Right.
Yeah, that is. So it's and the solutions can be solved immediately by electing a new president or re-electing the president. So it's immediate solutions are always the rage.
Now, 51 was the one I got my little double tab here, was the one that I thought when he was trying to make the point for the necessary for the separations of powers, when he talks about how ambition must be made to counteract ambition. And I just keep going back to the fact that these founders really believed, and he put it, it maybe reflects human nature, that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government, that they really did not trust themselves, they did not trust mankind with power. And so these powers had to be separated, and they had to clearly be defined. And in one of the Federalists, he makes the point that once a constitution is in place, the people running a state government or the national government should not be allowed to change that constitution lightly. It had to be changed, with cooperation of the people. And it just really kind of shows that maybe they were cynical or maybe they were realistic, depending on you're the philosopher. You can explain to us is greed and ambition human nature?
Well, in some ways of seeing things, I suppose. I mean, it depends on the philosopher. And there are as many positions that can be taken up on that issue as there are arguments.
I suppose that could never be proven scientifically. I guess all we can do is base it on behavior.
Yeah, but that's again part of the problem is that you could say something a priori, which is just to not appeal to evidence of all, and say that the particular conditions. I mean, this was Marx's view, is that the conditions of a capitalist society create greed and create avarice, right, and change human nature in a negative way. If you change the socioeconomic conditions that human beings find themselves in, they'll be much more cooperative.
Now, what about power? So if you create power, then does that make people crave power?
Well, Nietzsche says, again, that all human beings crave power. Right? And it really is about power, this pursuit of power. Not necessarily dominance, but power and the constructive uses of power. But there is this sort of also this corrupt form of power that will discharge itself as domination and exploitation, I suppose. Yeah. So again, but it really depends on the philosopher involved. And there are far more optimistic ways of thinking about human nature, very negative ways of thinking about human nature. But I read an article over the spring break that was arguing that if we presuppose a Darwinian conception of the world, I always sort of thought, well, that must mean that human nature is static. But this philosopher was arguing that human nature can evolve as well. So there's no static nature that's consistent throughout our evolutionary history. Human nature also evolves. And so you can imagine that we could pass through phases of sort of hunter-gatherer. There's a particular nature at work in a hunter-gathering society, and then as we progress as a species, a different type of nature will develop, and as we move into the future even farther, we might develop an even different nature. And that's a very intriguing thought.
Sure.
Completely amateur perspective on philosophy out there. I was going to say,
amateur philosophers were done.
It wasn't quite how I was going to phrase it, but okay.
There's a cut in the action that'll be Kent going after Steve. We'll rejoin you when the fight is resumed. It's done. Go ahead.
Anyway, if you look at simply the natural world, life itself is competition for resources. So we could say that greed in its most basic form is inherent in all things. But we don't need to call that true cynicism. For instance, when you say that greed is going to go away anytime soon, if the answer is no, then it's not necessarily cynical to put in provisions against it, just being thoughtful, looking ahead.
Well, and that's true too. I mean, greed is is not necessarily a bad thing. Self-interest is not necessarily a bad thing. And for Hobbes, this is very clear, and for many contractarians, there's actually a morality that grows out of self-interest. And that's the sort of premise on which Adam Smith sort of writes The Wealth of Nations. Right? It's self-interest that guides the economic forces, that lead to our greater prosperity as a species. So, yeah, self-interest is actually a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, then he also argued that the system of slavery, if replaced with wage earning, would be more productive, because if you gave people the incentive of working for themselves, which would be, I guess, in a way, self-interest, they would work harder and be more productive. So yeah, you could use that to your advantage.
There's something I'm curious about. In the earlier papers, there was this concerted effort to talk about term limits, it seemed. What I would call term limits today, right? So that and I'm worried about the legislature in particular, why the legislature doesn't have term limits. When there was this concerted effort in the Federalist Papers, especially the early ones, to talk about, that these officials will eventually step down. And of course that obtains in the executive branch, but it doesn't seem to obtain in the legislative branch. Why so? And how did that develop?
Yeah, I think that a lot of people were split by that. I think there was not a consensus. There were several issues at the convention that they simply could not come to a consensus on. One of them he talks about here, too, was voting rights. They could not come up with a consensus, so they felt it was best to leave that to the states. I think there were some people that felt that the best way to check power would be to have term limits. Now, originally the president was not term limited, but it was Washington had set the precedent of only serving for 8 terms. In this set, Madison argues against almost like term limits, saying that we need expertise in government. That when people are saying, well, why aren't we re-electing the House every 6 months or every year? He's saying, no, once people get there, they need time to learn the job and learn what's necessary to make government work effectively. So Madison would fall down on the side of those who said it's better to have expertise. And someone always said that we do have term limits. They're called elections.
Yeah.
You can always throw somebody out of office if you want them.
Because, like with the thing, the voting rights, the way I understood this to be was basically it was Madison saying we can't agree on who should get the right to vote, so we will just say that the states can determine it, but they need to put it in their state constitution, so that way it's basically set in stone and can't be changed just on the drop of a hat, or because, this person doesn't like this person on this certain Thursday or whatever, so they don't get to vote in the next election. And as far as the term limits go, it's like he spends a good deal of a few of these papers talking about the span of the term of office, and I kind of agree with what you said about, because he makes the argument that you need to have some length where people have enough time to gain an understanding of what they need to know to do the job, but not be in the job so long that they become corrupt or start being self-interested or whatever. And Madison makes the arguments that, with the elections every so often, that will allow fresh blood to come in, and you will have this transfer of knowledge so that the more learned people can teach the new people coming in, and like the level of knowledge will always be there to run the government, but you won't have to really worry about the kind of corrupt aspect of it coming in. And I think that was his argument against term limits as a specific idea. But
you can almost kind of envision a Congress where there's always new people coming in and then older experienced people there to kind of take them under their wing and show them the ropes.
Kind of like a patron client system which is kind of prevalent throughout history.
Yeah.
But I think part of that too also goes back to what was in one of the earlier papers where they basically said that the people who will work in government are chosen because they are the best of people, and they deserve to be the ones that are in government and making these decisions. And I think lately, especially, we've kind of gotten away from that, and it's more just a popularity contest.
Well, it's not a popularity contest. I think, I'm sorry, but it's certainly a contest of wealth. And I think, the decision, Supreme Court decision, Citizens United decision, I think is a tragic mistake. But I think that'll take us too far afield. So.
Well, I have to be honest. I was a person who always thought that freedom of speech was freedom of speech, and that meant if somebody could buy $1 gazillion worth of TV time, then that was free speech. And then I heard Justice Breyer, someone I rarely agree with on the Supreme Court, argue that giving one person too much speech could in effect infringe on speech. And I had never thought of that before. And that was, I thought, a very, very interesting perspective. One that at least did give me some cause to think. Now as for voting, most of the founders just believed that voting was not necessarily a right. It was more like a privilege. To them, a right was life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. Those were rights. Voting, they more looked at as a privilege, something you almost earned by being successful.
And I think that's probably why there wasn't any mention of term limits or anything, because if voting is a privilege, then the people who get to vote will have the knowledge and understanding of how things work and realize that people shouldn't be left doing the same thing for too long, that you need to have new people come in and take over and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and they certainly felt that to them, the best people to govern were the people who had been successful first in private life. That was a way of showing that you were hardworking, that you were prosperous, and so then it was just naturally thought that would then be reflected as you were as a public servant. So voting was something that and there certainly were people out there saying, "Hey, wait a minute, just because I don't have property doesn't mean the government couldn't do damage to me." But the whole point of the revolution was protect people's private property and stop the government from taking it. And so, the people best to do that were the people who had private property. Should somebody who doesn't own property vote on property tax? It's easy to say, yeah, tax it at 100%. Go ahead. We came for your tax bill. I don't know anything. So once, he kind of made his final talk as to why we need to have this, and it's not going to infringe on the rights of the state, he goes to start talking about the actual government, in particular, specific branches, I should say, and he starts with the House of Representatives. And one of the biggest, earliest debates was, would there be enough representatives in the House of Representatives to really represent the people? Because that was one of the anti-federalists' biggest complaints was there was roughly going to be one representative for every 30 to 35,000 people. And they thought, how could one person know what 30 to 35,000 people really need? And then again, Madison does a really good job of pointing out how in various state legislatures, the proportionment is not that different.
I thought Madison did a good job of kind of explaining why the proportionment of one representative for roughly 30,000 people would work, and he made some references also to, you have to make sure that representative comes from that area that he's representing, and he made the case talking about the House of Commons in England, where he said that for so many seats, for some 300 seats, it was representing almost 600 people, and then there was another group of 200 that was representing basically the rest of the bulk of the country, and it didn't work because a lot of those people weren't in the areas they were representing. But the one that really got me was number 54, where he's talking about how about slaves and if they should be rolled into counting as far as the number of representatives in the House. And I found it really interesting that he makes the argument that it's in the best interest of basically the slaveholding states to count slaves as both property and people, because then they kind of get the benefits of both, as opposed to if you try and say that slaves were just property, then you lose out on having them count towards the population and getting more representatives. And it, like, for the fact that they were really trying to, it seems at this point they were really trying to figure out how to kind of start pushing slavery towards getting it done away with, that he brought this argument out that there's a way to kind of shine a positive light on how to look at it. I found that really interesting.
Yeah, you know, the Three-Fifths Clause is one of the most controversial elements of the Constitution. I thought he does a really good job of explaining it, of how, you know, the South, obviously, for political power, wants more seats in the House of Representatives, so of course, slaves are people. And then you can kind of start to say, well, if they're people, should they really be slaves? Should they be free? Shouldn't they have equal rights? Well, no, they're property. Okay, well then if they're property, we'll tax them accordingly.
Because there's a part here where Madison makes the distinction of saying that on the one hand a slave is property because he is owned by a master, and that master can set his ability to what he can do when he has to work and punish him for breaking whatever the rules are on that plantation. But then he goes on to say that, oh, well, they're people too, because the law says that only the slave master who owns that person has them. They're protected from outside people just coming up and harassing them all. And I think for slavery being the kind of vilified institution that it is now, to read this, it's really kind of interesting that someone could kind of take maybe the moral side away from the issue and look at it just as...
Well, you know, in 1788, most societies in the world were practicing slavery. So slavery was starting to become a moral issue, and certainly by 1820, 1830, most of the Christian world had stopped using slavery, so slavery had become the peculiar institution to the South. But at this time, there was still that debate about, was slavery still okay, still acceptable? You know, a lot of it comes out of the old Greek mindset that someone's got to do the dirty work in society and nobody really wants to do it, so we're going to, you know, slot a class of people to do that. Now, you know, slavery was obviously much, much more than that, but yeah, I think that this paper, I'm almost thinking that next time I teach in the Constitution, I'll have them read this for the discussion on the Three-Fifths Clause, because it really does kind of show that moment in which they're both people and property, and we're trying to decide, you know, obviously the North is abolishing slavery, but the South chooses to keep it, so it really kind of is, you know, America's teetering at this point. But there certainly were a lot of voices in the South saying, you know, yeah, all men are created equal. We do need to get rid of this institution, so.
Yeah, just a couple years after, in 1790, there started to be the petitions coming in to abolish slavery, and that even then you had some of the Southern representatives saying, if you want to do this, we're out of here, we're seceding. And so these kind of things came up, and it didn't really get intense until the 1800s, obviously, but these, the half slave, half free, it was like it said, it was pretty intense. At this point, I wonder if New York still had slaves in 1788.
It would be right about this time. I don't have the exact date, but New York would have abolished it right around this time. So I think just about every northern state had pretty much abolished it by 1790. There were a couple that went into the early 1800s. But you know, in the North, slavery was just never a big issue because there were just so few slaves. And that's why, you know, the Southerners, it was easy for the North to say, oh, we'll get rid of it because have to check for next time for sure.
It's interesting, he kind of wrote this as, most of Federalist Paper 54 is, imagine here's what a Southerner would say. And he's a Virginian, you know, so it's interesting that he was really very familiar with this. And then at the end he says, I'm not sure if I'm fully convincing, but you can at least admit that there's some points here.
Yeah, no, I really thought he was doing a good job here in trying to explain how the Southerner felt. So it's almost, you know, obviously he's writing to New Yorkers, Northerners, he's wanting to tell them. Because if I remember right, it was a New Yorker, Gouverneur Morris, who at the Constitutional Convention proposed abolishing slavery.
Okay.
So, you know, that could be in response to that. You know, telling the North, hey, look, this is why, you know, slaves are being counted as people. You know, this is a compromise, in essence. Yeah, it's a compromise that benefits people.
Along that line too, I think it's also kind of maybe trying to show like steps towards starting to abolish it is that, see, we're counting them as people, not just property. So, you know, maybe people in the North kind of saw that as maybe a step on the path towards removing slavery as an institution.
Yeah,
but that's just me.
Yeah, could very well have been, yeah.
Well, you know, some of the, people like Jefferson, and some of the others really did. Jefferson would have loved to just had slavery disappear, but even for his own life, he was so entangled with it that he couldn't even free the slaves on his death, like say Washington did. And so it was kind of an interesting time where a lot of the leading thinkers are saying, you know, we wish we could get rid of this, but we just don't see how, you know. But they put that the Congress can end the slave trade in 1808.
Right.
But yeah, there's just no. They didn't see a way to get out of it. And maybe there were ways that they didn't understand, but it was it's a very interesting issue. And it seems to get even more entrenched in the South over the course of the next 50 years.
Yeah.
With expansion of
Cotton, yeah. No, Jefferson always said slavery was like holding a wolf by the ears. You didn't like it, but you didn't dare let it go. You know, Jefferson himself said, well, if I freed my slaves, society is so prejudicial against them, they've got no chance of making it. So he felt it was better to keep them as slaves so that they would be, you know, fed and have clothing and have shelter.
It's kind of the idea of, we know this doesn't really work, but we know how it works, so it's better to go with what we know than hope for some ideal that is off in the distance that we have no clue about.
Yeah, it's almost like knowing the difference between the way things should be and the way things are. You know, Jefferson knew the way things are, and the way things should be. I would criticize him for being equally responsible for it because he in Washington could have been much more vocal about ending slavery and making African Americans equal full citizens of the United States. But that idea to them, whereas the idea of maybe getting slavery was not that radical to them, the idea of African Americans being equal full citizens of the United States was just too radical to them.
That idea of a biracial society being totally untenable. You see in the Lincoln-Douglas debate, where Lincoln and some of the other of the anti-slavery people just said, well, if we can end slavery, we can get on the ships back to Africa, and there's no way we can live together. So this is Lincoln in the 1850s is probably he's the most famous anti-slavery politician of the day, and even he's unwilling to say there should be any kind of equality. He's willing to say they're equally human, but living together and equal, there's just no way it could happen. And it's just fascinating that was almost like unthinkable.
Right.
Just the way that idea took hold of the biracial society just was untenable.
Right. And even when he was president, he, as he was trying to work on emancipation plans, they all included recolonization or colonization. And they actually did recolonize some Africans to the Caribbean. It was a huge fiasco, but there's this famous speech or talk he has with Frederick Douglass and other leading African Americans during the Civil War when he's like, you all need to leave, because because it's just, we're never going to forget you were slaves, and you were never going to forget that you were slaves, and yeah, we're not all going to get along. So,
Yeah, I think Lincoln kind of pushed the whole colonization idea just because he saw that slavery had been around too long. The views and ideals of them were too deeply entrenched. Like, there are still people today that, you know, they're few and far between and generally considered lunatics, but there are people today that think that slavery should be reinstated for whatever reason, just because they're that far out of being towards being racist and some other things. But it's like,
I mean, many Southerners always defended slavery as the necessary evil, you know, of these people are here, they were brought here by people before us, and we certainly don't want them to be equal citizens, and so what else can we do with them except enslave them? That was an argument until the 1830s, 1840s, until it was pretty apparent that the whole world didn't feel that way or agree with them, and then of course they made the famous switch to slavery being a positive good, actually a better labor system than the wage labor system. That's, you know, another talk altogether.
I would keep in mind that there are many sources that would say that there are more slaves now than there were then, and that they may be a smaller percentage of the population, but in fact there's many more.
Yeah, if you go to the United Nations website, yeah, that you can find out all kinds of things about slavery. Yeah, no, I tell my students that slavery is an ancient practice and it's still being practiced today.
Yeah.
And there's still a lot of societies that use it. It's just, to some degree, it's always been a kind of an accepted thing.
And then the whole clandestine slave trade with people who are insurance and bond
Trafficking
labor.
or something like that, yeah. Now, to address the concerns that people had about there being, the House of Representatives being too small, when the Constitution was in the process of being ratified, Madison, Hamilton, and the Federalists said that they would add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution. And so, right after the Constitution was ratified, in his inaugural address, George Washington said, hey, we've got to keep our promise. So, the states sent Madison some 80 amendments. He picked and chose, went through them, got 20 that he liked, sent it to Congress. Congress approved 12 of them and sent them to the states. And, of course, 10 of them were approved right away. They became known as the Bill of Rights. One of the amendments of the 12 that was not approved would have reapportioned the House of Representatives every 10 years based on the census. And historians, political scientists have looked at that language and estimate that if that amendment had passed, the House of Representatives could be as high as 5,000 people today. Anywhere from about 800 to 5,000, depending on how you interpreted the language. And I just always thought that, could you imagine 8,000 people in Washington? It's bad enough with 435.
well, because even in here, Madison makes kind of the argument for reapportioning the House every 10 years based off the census, but then he also kind of argues against himself a little bit in saying that, because he makes the argument that people, like, in order to prevent the tyranny of the majority, there need to be enough dissimilar opinions where there's no one coalition that can clearly take one side of an issue and create that tyranny. But then he also says that you can't have so many opinions that it's just everybody shouting at once.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, that was one of his, his famous arguments against the national government becoming tyrannical is we are so many different sects, so many different groups that, you would have to compromise to come up with a majority. So one small minority would never, ever really be able to inflict its will upon the people. They should have looked. They did quickly reapportion the House after the first census. I'm not quite sure how many numbers they increased it to, but we began with about 60 that was, that's nearly 100 years ago, so I've never heard any scuttlebutt about is it time to think about adding more members.
I mean, I'm sure there's probably somebody somewhere pushing for it, but there's so many other issues that are taking precedence nowadays.
Sure.
So I'm sure that
Well,
the average person
The
doesn't
average
really
person on
care.
the street,
yeah, I would say given.
ask average person on the street, do you think Congress should be expanded down to for a population level? Can you what?
Add to the deficit for sure.
It's like my mortgage is underwater, gas is almost $5 a gallon, I barely have a job, and you want me to worry about what?
I thought one of the big themes, so that just has been brought up just throughout the whole time, would be just balances. You have the federal governments to balance the states. You have the states to, and the people to balance the federal government. You have, I was trying to find the exact paper, but he said something interesting. He said, the people's reason is what should control the government, and the government should control the people's passion. So the government checks the people and say, everybody gets upset. Let's just throw all this group in jail. Well, we have the Constitution, we have the government to sort of say they can't do that. Doesn't always work, obviously. But then the people's reason should shape the government. So it was kind of an interesting, dual check. And then Federalist 51 is one of those classic ones where you've got, there's no way the checks on the outside can balance the government. You can't have the people check the government by having a convention. So all the checks, or most of the checks, have to be internal. I thought that was an interesting argument. And
Yeah, and then when he was, discussing the legislature, he reminded that there's two houses in the legislature, so there's kind of a separation of powers or a check and balance within one of the checks and balances. And to this day, the Senate still views itself as kind of the more deliberate body because at the convention they were really worried about the people's passion. Let's kill the firstborn male in every household. Well, that could fly right through the House of Representatives, and then the Senate would cool things down and say, well, that was tried once, it didn't work.
Yeah, like we were talking about balance, that was one of the things that I felt was kind of an overall theme throughout a lot of these papers is Madison saying that, okay, look, these are hard problems that we have to deal with. I don't think there's a clear-cut solution to them, so we just have to find that balance that keeps everything as even as possible, and as we go, we'll keep adjusting things as necessary to keep that balance.
Scott and I run out of ideas. Lots of verse. Ones that won't get me in trouble.
That's what
Put it that way.
What I think is interesting is in terms of balance is that you also have journalism, which I think is very important to the people involved in this. And in fact, these papers are journalism.
Sure.
And so that sort of is a essential element.
The fourth branch of government, some people call it sometimes. And yeah, in fact, it's the only constitutionally protected industry. The freedom of the press clause. So yeah, I think they clearly saw that as important because they saw how important it is they could use it themselves. I don't know if we would call this propaganda or not, but they clearly were using the media, the newspaper, to get across their point of view.
Well, I think that in terms of government, you have this system for vetting ideas, and this is part of that system. So that like the way you talked about the difference between the Senate and the House, same thing occurring only almost in public.
leak a little bit of information on something to get people talking and find out what the general public attitude is before they roll out a piece of legislation or whatever it is, and that kind of thing.
No, I think that with the advent of the internet and social media, that I hope I'm around in 50, 60 years to see how much it's all going to change, because everything is now available to everybody. You know, and I mean, in good, bad, or indifferent, you simply are not going to be able to, I hope, not pull the wool over people's eyes anymore because of this. Whereas in the past, some people would argue, well, the media is obviously biased toward liberalism. We can't get our message out. Well, now you can. And, you know, and if you can't get your message through Fox, MSNBC, CNN, you can have your own webpage, you can tweet.
Blogosphere.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I was reading a study that showed that the younger generation, fully 60% or more of them are getting their news and information from the internet and nowhere else.
Yeah.
And that's the key. The internet's so diverse, it's finding the truth through some of the noise, because there is a lot of stuff out there that's just not worth reading.
Like now, we have to deal a lot more with like information overload and
Yeah.
trying to
Exactly.
like, because you go on like basically any website that people have homepage, with the possible exception of Google because they don't put anything on there, but like Yahoo, MSNBC, some of these other search engines like that, or these websites that do all these services, the main thing you see is these scrolling little news bits, and they have these headlines up, and you just click on whatever you want to read. You know, some of it might have some relevance, and some of it's, you know, oh, hey, this celebrity got a puppy, check out the pictures.
Yeah, no, and the just the vast diversity of the information online too lets people, if you want to, you can just read only stuff you agree with. You can never be challenged, right?
Yeah.
You can always just find, I do it, you know, and it reinforces, you know, for good or for ill, what you already think. It can do that. You have to have kind of the discipline to be like, well, all right, let's see what a different perspective is, even if you're not going to agree with it. It's just like, there might be something out there that you might not know. It doesn't cater to what you're looking for already. But yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see how that changes things and what kind of, if there will be any more kind of order brought to it in a sense, or if it'll just keep getting more and more fragmented.
I mean, I think there'll come a point where it'll keep expanding out for a little bit, but then it'll come to that point where just like due to how expansive it is, it won't be able to sustain itself, so it'll have to collapse back down again. And you've kind of seen that in some other things in the past as far as industry and like other types of media and whatnot.
Just put me in charge of what should be on it.
I really think there are some very, very interesting implications of social networking and just information in general. I really think our notions of privacy have changed dramatically with the advent of Facebook. I think, you know, that will continue. I really see us moving into an area where we have not ventured before in terms of privacy issues. I think we live in a much more open society, and the next generation, my children, for example, I think that they'll be very, very different in terms of how they think about what I should share, what I shouldn't, which I think is really quite interesting. And I also think, you know, speculate in terms of what's coming in the next 1,000 years or so. It's just quite remarkable. But full integration with technology, I really think that we will literally be cybernetic organisms. I wouldn't dispute that at all. I mean, we're becoming much more increasingly mechanized. You know, everything from holding an iPhone in my hand, which is just an extension of my voice, you know, and it's quite fascinating. And I think
words and the tone and just what they're saying and how thought out it is. You wouldn't be able to write something like this today because you have too many people. Like if there's a politician trying to come up with something like this today, to have too many people on Facebook and Twitter and whatever other social networking, social media stuff there is. Oh, are you done yet? Are you done yet? What is, have you thought about putting this in there? And it's like, a person would just get so frustrated with all this background chatter being screamed at them through capital letters on the screen all the time that they'd just be like, oh, screw it.
Could Madison get Federalist 51 into 160 characters? So he could tweet it.
Windows caps lock is cruise control for cool.
Governments are inherently selfish. We'll turn it against itself. But yeah, although it's important to keep in mind too that probably most New Yorkers never read this, in the sense that literacy was much lower. They had.
Would you say property owning New Yorkers would have been interested?
I would think so.
And also, I know, you could make the argument that this was, yes, the property-owning class debating amongst itself.
People who
And then there was
that vote.
property owning wouldn't have been a tiny group either, because you had a lot of people who had, so it would be sort of like something in between of like universal suffrage and just a tiny, I don't know what kind of percent it would be, but yeah, I would think that property owners most likely, including some people in the frontier who own things.
Yeah,
But there was a lot of just kind of low culture entertainment then too.
I'm sure there are probably plenty of people living up in the Adirondacks up near the St. Lawrence River that were never even heard of these. And,
Let's pause the burlesque show and read the latest Federalist paper.
I mean, like in Boston, they had Pope's Day. They would just give these big effigies of the Pope and have all these things just march out and just to say, down with this guy. He's terrible and threat to our liberties and all this. Just there's a lot. The Boston mob that would fight and use them to go after the governor and stuff. When during the British, go ransack the governor's house. All right. But yeah, the media environment challenges today are definitely completely different. More people than ever can access it, but you
More
gotta
people
think.
can create it too.
More people can create it.
On
Yeah.
your blogs, you've got one of the biggest arguments out there right now with your big media companies. Well, they didn't go to a university. They don't have that skin on the wall. They're not journalists. Wait a minute. They're
Right.
doing a pretty good job of getting the message out there.
Right.
Yeah, definitely. Our definitions are going to have to change.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And it's going to be hard for places that need a profit to exist.
Oh, yeah.
Because so much of it is, free that.
I just wonder someday some Twitter blog is going to be a primary source in a Western civilization book 100 years from now.
Yeah, in the right context, it would be.
Sure, yeah.
Just as long as it isn't Twilight.
Yeah.
Although KCC makes no formal opinion about novels.
Views expressed here are not necessarily those of the KCC. Its board of trustees or its president, but only those of the Three Stooges. Bring you back this iron before we get in trouble.
Yeah.
You got to officially wrap it up.
Do you want to wrap it up?
Well, okay, we'll be back in 2 weeks with Federalist Papers 57 through
66.
66. Stay tuned.